Hey everyone, today on Big Al Books I'm going to be doing my August wrap-up. I keep wanting to say July wrap-up, but that's mostly because I'm in denial that the summer is wrapping up. Doesn't seem right to me. Anyway, I got through 8 books this month. I was away on vacation for about 3 weeks. My boyfriend and I packed up our car and drove from Ontario over to the west coast of Canada. So that was a very good time. Bought a lot of books, because every new city that you stop in, you gotta check out what the used bookstores are like, and I had a whole trunk to work with. So bought a lot of books, didn't really end up reading that many, but one of the books that I did read throughout our trip was On the Road by Jack Kerouac, and this was a reread for me. I probably read this book for the first time when I was around 16 years old, about to enter my edgy Beat Generation phase. I realized that I had remembered virtually nothing about the plot of this book, but what I had remembered was the really strong feelings that it left me with at the time, which were to drop out of school and take off on some wild adventures with no real destination. So that's why I thought this would be the perfect time of my life to reread this book while I was on a road trip, because I was really in the right frame of mind for this kind of book. There really isn't much of a plot. It's not about what happens. Some people like to trash talk this book, saying that it can only appeal to naive young people, but I don't think that that's true at all. I think anyone with a sense of adventure could find something to connect with about this book. There are so many great descriptive passages about what America is like from coast to coast, and great descriptive writing about the excitement of jazz music, which was really blossoming at the time. Another thing that I really liked is that this book is not always glorifying life on the road, and in fact a lot of the times when Jack and his friend are going to take off on these adventures, it's almost described as madness. It's like a sickness takes over them. They get this itch and they just have to go off. It's not always a good thing that's happening to them, and a lot of stuff goes wrong on these adventures. The car is always breaking down, or they get into run-ins with the police officers, and friends have falling outs. This book ends with a pretty disastrous journey. They decide to travel down south into South America, and it is not really a happy ending, and friends are bailing on each other, and it's not all as fun as you think that it's going to be at the start of the adventure. There are some elements of this book that haven't aged very well. The guys in this book are pretty sexist, and they don't treat the women in their lives very well. Also, there is a hilarious passage in here where the main character, Sal Paradise, is roaming around, and he's literally feeling sorry for himself because he was born a white man, and that's like really tragic because his life isn't as interesting. And this is one of the lines. I wished I were a Denver Mexican, or even a poor, overworked Jap. Anything but what I was so drearily, a white man, disillusioned. So that passage had me laughing out loud. So there's kind of some dated stuff like that. But overall, this book was pretty fun. I was reading it at a perfect time, and I enjoyed giving it another go. While I was at a used bookstore, I found a copy of another Jack Kerouac novel. This one's called Visions of Cody, and the quote on the front says, "To read On the Road, but not Visions of Cody, is to take a nice sightseeing tour, but to forego the spectacular rapids of Jack Kerouac's wildest writing." So I guess that means I'm probably going to have to check out this one as well. I have heard nothing about it, so if you know anything about Visions of Cody, please let me know what to expect for this one. The next book I read is an older Canadian classic. That is Wild Geese by Martha Ostenso. This is a book set on the Canadian prairies, so I was reading it while we were driving through the prairies. And this is a dysfunctional family drama. And at the center of the story is this evil, tyrannical farmer who pushes his family way too hard so that he can make as much money from his farm as possible. And he's super evil and mean to his neighbors. The whole novel is just building tension because you know that something terrible is going to happen. The family is just pushed to their limits. So it was actually a fun page turner. I was kind of thinking this was going to be dusty and dry, but it was a pretty good drama. Wanting to know what was going to happen to these characters kept me turning the pages, but there were quite a few things about the writing that I didn't like, especially when Martha Ostenso was too obvious with her literary devices. There was one scene in dialogue where one of the characters mentions that Caleb, the evil farmer, is a symbol of the land, and I found that in very poor taste to come out and actually tell us what your characters symbolize, even when it was already pretty obvious. You don't need to spoon feed the reader like that. So there were some awkward things like that. You could tell that she was a debut novelist trying to look impressive. So it wasn't an excellent novel by any means, but still, it was pretty fun and a lot better than I was expecting. The next two books I read were debut short story collections. We have Teardown by Clea and Barreling Forward by Eva Crocker. I picked up both of these books in a bookstore in the small town in British Columbia where they have a writing festival every year. And both of these authors were going to appear as panelists for the new Canadian Voices thing, so I thought it would be fun to check out some younger Canadian writers. Clea Young is from Vancouver, Eva Crocker is from St. John's, Newfoundland, so that's kind of this coast-to-coast thing. But while I enjoyed flipping through this collection, neither author really blew me away. I wasn't super impressed by either of these. I found that both authors were competent and you could see how they do well in writing school, but I found both of them were just really writing about their lives and that there wasn't a wide range of imaginative scope in either of these collections. Like from reading Teardown by Clea Young, I knew that she was a young mother because so many of these stories were just about what it's like being a mom and how your marriage changes, and like I feel like most of these stories have a reference to nipples at some point, and also most of these stories were set in British Columbia where she's from, so I felt like I was kind of reading more about the author and her life experiences. This set of stories is largely about relationships. There's a great story in here about a couple that gets into a fight at IKEA, which felt relatable, but again, nothing all that memorable. And same for Barreling Forward. Eva Crocker kind of writes about these sort of hipster losers living in St. John's, Newfoundland. Again, not a wide scope of things that were going on. There were some fun stories in this collection. There was one about a teacher who gets scabies and he has to tell the other teacher that he hooked up with about this, and he's like offering to share the disinfectant cream with her, and that one was pretty funny and awkward. And there's another one about a man who's been a server most of his life and he has internalized a lot of the negativity and bitterness that comes along with the job, and that one was a lot of fun. But for the most part, these were kind of those short stories that are just vignettes. They just show you the snapshot of someone's life. Nothing really special is happening. And at the end of the story, you're just like, what was the point of that? Maybe I just don't get short stories. Like, why did I bother reading this? Like, for example, there's this one story, and you know, it had the potential to be pretty sad. It was about a guy whose marriage fell apart, his wife found someone else now, and he's lonely. And this was the last sentence of the story. Before Cyril left for work the next morning, he watched them pour the foundation of the parking garage. The wet concrete had the thick, gluey consistency of oatmeal. And that to me is just, that does not cut it as your final sentence of your short story. And just because that you are an observant writer who can do some descriptive passages doesn't mean that your story is going to be interesting or memorable. So that was kind of my problem with this one. I feel bad that I'm not being more supportive of these upcoming Canadian writers, and if you are looking for some fun, easy breezy short story collections, check them out from your library. You know, they're good for the most part, just didn't really blow me away, and I can't say that I'm super excited about what these authors are going to do next. But the next short story collection that I did read was also a debut collection, but from like the 90s, and that was Traplines by Eden Robinson. And I read her book Monkey Beach a few months ago and totally loved it, so I have since bought all her other books. These stories were awesome. These are the kind of stories that are entertaining to read, but afterwards you felt like they had purpose and meaning, and even a narrative arc, which is kind of fun. So Eden Robinson is really great at writing angsty adolescent voices. So she's very convincing with these teenage characters, and they are not living easy lives. Lots of dysfunctional family situations. One of these characters has this rich cousin that moves in with him, and he has to figure out whether he's really nice or a twisted psychopath. The best story in this collection is about a girl whose mother is actually a serial killer. So if you've ever wondered what that experience might be like, then you should read that story for sure. There's only one story in here that was a miss for me, but even then, a lot of the material in that story would be later reworked into her novel Monkey Beach, so it was interesting to see how some of the stuff from that novel goes back into some of her earlier fiction. But yes, this was a very good collection for the most part, especially for a debut author, and I had a lot of fun reading it, even though most of these stories are very dark and twisted. The next book I read was Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, and I feel like I need to get more into Terry Pratchett. I haven't read him since I was a kid, but Discworld is kind of intimidating. And as for Neil Gaiman, I like some of his stuff. I mentioned this in a previous video, but he was like my best friend for a few months while I was listening to his audiobook in the car. So excited to revisit more of his stuff. And this was a pretty fun book. I got super ripped off. I bought this at a used bookstore and it was behind the counter. You know, I already had a stack full of books. I was like, oh, just throw that one on the pile. I did not look at the price. And then later I did. So it says $7.99 on the back and I bought it for $8, and it is like a clearly visibly marked spine, so I somehow paid 1 more cent for this beat up copy. But whatever, it was still pretty fun. I don't have that much to say about this book. Like, I just wanted something enjoyable that I could flip through in the car, and that's what this was. It's, you know, if you like that British humor, this book will have you laughing. It is about the apocalypse and the Antichrist, but it's not really that dark. It's more comical. So it was a fun one to flip through. Didn't change my life or anything, but I had a good time. And it was cute to see these two collaborating and having fun with their writing together. So would recommend if you like either of these authors. Good Omens was a fun, light, and fluffy novel, but the book that I read next was anything but that. This is The Book of Night Women by Marlon James. It's a story about a girl named Lilith who is born into slavery on a Jamaican sugar plantation in the late 1700s, and it's her coming-of-age tale. She's starting to grow up, learn more about how messed up the world is around her, and she becomes involved with this group of women who meet up secretly at night and are planning to overthrow the plantation. So this book is very violent, very disturbing, and very stressful. It's one of those books that I just could not put down, partly because I was really engaged with the story and wanted to know what happened, but also partly because I just needed it to be over. I mean, you are suffering while you are reading this book. This is a tough book about a brutal subject, but it is so worth it. This book is just so well crafted. It's written in this gorgeous Jamaican patois dialect, and it will have you feeling so many feelings. It is a very emotional read. So if you are interested in books about slavery, this is one of the best books about slavery I've ever read, especially if you're looking to get a more global perspective. This is not set in America, and it will give you a new perspective about what slavery was like in the West Indies. So very rewarding book. If you want to hear any more about it, I did a review video a few days ago about this book, totally gushing over it, so I will link that down below. This is definitely one of the best books that I've read this year so far, and I am now 3 for 3 with Marlon James. I have read all the books that he's put out so far. They have all impressed me, and I just can't wait to see what he's going to do next. He is one of those living writers that I'm just so excited about, especially because his next project is a trilogy of fantasy novels inspired by African mythology, so you know that that is going to be hella good. The last book I read this month was some nonfiction. It is called Bury the Chains, Prophets and Rebels in the Fight to Free an Empire's Slaves by Adam Hochschild. So my grandma lent me this book probably about a year ago, so it was high time that I got around to reading it. She has an excellent taste in books. Particularly, she reads a lot of nonfiction, so if she loans it out to me, I know that it's going to be really good. And I was so inspired to pick this up while I was reading The Book of Night Women, because that book is about slavery in Jamaica in the 1700s, and this book is set more on the British end, and it's about one of history's largest and most important social justice campaigns, and that was the fight to end the slave trade and slavery itself in the British Empire. We're introduced to these historical figures that come across as larger-than-life characters, like Grenville Sharp, who who is a musician and a crotchety old man and a prolific letter writer. There's the leader of the movement, Thomas Clarkson, who just literally got up on his horse and rode around the whole country trying to gather people's support, trying to make people engaged in this issue. And then we have people like Toussaint Louverture, who was leading the slave revolt in Saint Domingue. Like, there is a full cast of characters in this book, each person so fascinating. Though most of this book is about white British activists, people of color definitely played a huge role in ending slavery as well. This book focuses a lot on the rebellions that were happening all over the West Indies and were fighting their own battles to free themselves. And there are also important historical figures like Equiano, who wrote a famous journal that a lot of people read and opened their eyes to what the slavery experience was like. So it's not entirely a white savior book, though there is a lot of that. There are so many rich, condescending British characters in here that you just want to slap in the face, who are like acting like they're being such noble people, and it's like a charitable act to free the slaves and not just like basic common human decency. So those sections can be kind of maddening, but overall this was a very engaging historical read, very approachable for nonfiction, and definitely a good book to check out if you want to learn more. So those are the books that I read this month. I'm currently working my way through this beast of a novel. This is Almanac of the Dead by Leslie Marmon Silko. She is a Laguna Pueblo author, writes a lot about the First Nations experience in America, and I've been meaning to read her for a long time. I'm glad that I'm finally doing that. This book is pretty cryptic so far, and it's got a wide cast of characters, and it's largely about this intersection between American culture and Mexican culture and First Nations culture, and it is going to be a wild ride, I'm sure. I'm about a third of the way through, and there's still 500 pages to go, so who knows how this is going to go, but it's already been pretty violent and gripping, and I am into it. Yeah, that's what I've been reading. Let me know what you've been reading, and I'll see you next time.